Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers and the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. My guest this week is Dr. Jen Jones, Director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she leads the center's research, policy, and outreach efforts around science policy, scientific integrity, the science of elections, and disinformation. Welcome to the program, Dr. Jones.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I really was excited to have Union of Concerned Scientists on, in part because my background is in science and I transitioned to social justice, and also in part because we don't often think, of scientific organizations as being deeply interested in matters of social justice and matters of humanity. So for those people who've never heard of what UCS is or does, how do you explain its main goal?
Our main goal is to use science for solutions, and those solutions should create a more healthy and just world. So justice and equity are centered in everything we do. We believe that science should work for the public and it should inform the policies that really protect the health of people, the health of planet, from clean air to safe food to equitable transportation. Science should work for people, and as you said in your intro, not just for billionaires.
So what are the issues that you work on? I often associate science with, things around public health, maybe vaccines or gun violence or climate. How do you identify your areas of interest for UCS?
So we're over 50 years old, and we were founded by scientists who were part of and concerned about the rise of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And so we still do that work around nuclear safety, but now we do all sorts of things from, climate solutions for communities to I lead the Center for Science and Democracy, where we really focus on protecting science to inform federal policies for communities and people, especially frontline communities. Certainly, we deal with some of the public health that you mentioned. We have a program that looks at issues of food security, food safety, equitable food systems, and so much more. So we work on a lot of issues, but I think the theme that ties everything together, again, is that equity and justice perspective, that we do original research, we organize individuals and groups, we sit in coalitions, and ultimately we bring all that together to advocate for solutions. And a lot of that work is at the federal level, but we also work to implement good and equitable policy at city and local levels as well.
And it's quite interesting because there's, of course, a sordid history of how science has been used or weaponized, a long time ago, and even to an extent today, by nefarious forces to reinforce discrimination, to reinforce white supremacy or dehumanize people. That sordid history, I know, haunts a lot of scientists of conscience. And is UCS also informed by that? Because, of course, science has the potential to do so much good, but also enable power. So really needs to be checked.
Absolutely. And I think that is recognized in our mission and our ethos and our vision as it's evolved over the decades. That's what brought me to the Union of Concerned Scientists, that it recognizes the role of white supremacy, both in the history of science, but how it can actively be used or has been used for those nefarious reasons. And so, science in itself is not a solution, right? The solutions really come from the people. And what we really try and do is have the science that we work on, the science policy that we advocate for, stand by and support community lived experience, traditional ecological knowledge, and other ways of knowing. So that we think of it's not just that traditional sort of Western centric science. It should really be all of those things. And the dangers that you mentioned, that history, that awful history of violence is absolutely real. And I would, call to this unique moment that we're seeing right now with the Trump presidency and his allies in the White House and Congress that, through their actions we've seen in the first months or this first year of their administration, I dare say that a lot of their policies are recapturing that history. And so one of the key issues that we have worked on at the Center for Science and Democracy for decades now, before I came, is really this idea of defending federal science, especially from political influence. So we have tracked what we call attacks on science, again, for decades. And these are attacks that basically, interfere with good policy. They hurt people, they hurt communities, they violate principles of scientific integrity and trust. And so while every administration of the past decades and every political party has committed scientific integrity violations or attacks on science, what we're seeing now in this first year of the second Trump presidency truly is a show of horrors. And so many of these policies that they're enacting are being done to, number one, enrich those billionaires, centralize power in the executive branch, and do it by ignoring science that can solve problems. And rather, they are uplifting what I call junk science. Look at their anti-vax stuff, their anti-public health measures, so many more things. So suddenly I just mentioned that as a reminder that we come from that history. UCS is trying to do better, but in the federal government, sadly, we're seeing a real rise of those attacks on science.
I want to talk about the Center for Science and Democracy, which is what you oversee at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I don't often think about science as informing elections and democracy. So explain what this particular center does, how science can offer or help be deployed in solutions around preserving democracy.
Sure. Well, I like to think that science and democracy absolutely go hand in hand. And at the Center for Science and Democracy, I always like to explain it in two different ways that we work on democracy. There's the big D of democracy, which is what most people think of. Those are things like elections, electoral systems, your formal voting processes and procedures, if you will. And we use science to make those processes more equitable, right? So, we released research last year. We're going to be releasing new research in the coming weeks and months that shows how there's a need for better data transparency around elections. The way voter data is gathered, the way it's shared with community groups who do the organizing, the way that data then might be used for drawing new political boundaries, and so many things that comes down to data and evidence. And so the way we capture that data, the way we analyze that data can be done in ways that is more equitable or less equitable. And so we have produced a suite of recommendations that we're advocating for a number of states across the country to adopt our equitable ballot transparency measures and these other things that would make that electoral system more democratic. And the people who are often least represented, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, using these recommendations would actually see their representation improve. So that's the big D of democracy. We also work on what I like to think of as the little d of democracy. And that's basically like, the federal government works for us, right? We both depend on and should demand that the federal government is there to help produce those things like clean air, clean water. If your kid is taking, medicine for a health condition, you want to know that it has undergone rigorous testing, that it is safe. For your kid, the same way when you get on an airplane, you want to know that those systems are safe and being monitored. And so, the federal government is behind the scenes on so many of those things. And what they choose to work on, and then how they implement the policies and regulations that ultimately shape the day-to-day management of food, of medicine, of transportation. Like, we, the people, have a right and a responsibility to inform that. Right. So that's that little d of democracy where we can show up through numerous processes and procedures that exist and make our voices heard, make our needs heard, make it clear to the government if they are, creating like Trump has done, all these executive orders that have overturned climate change measures. Those are hurting, again, those frontline environmental justice communities. And sadly, that little d of democracy is being threatened. We produced a report a few months ago that shows how this Trump White House is really sidelining the will and the voices of impacted communities to show up and make a difference. So again, it comes down to data, it comes down to evidence, it comes down to using science to create those policies and laws that are going to keep our families safe.
What are the main obstacles that Union of Concerned Scientists faces in implementing the goals? I imagine these days, front and center is simply loss of federal dollars and the federal government's attack on science. And that obviously is a huge thing, especially when it comes to just people who are scientists who have worked for the government losing their jobs. Huge losses on that. And also just loss of funding for universities as well. Is that the centerpiece of the obstacles you face, or are there others you can identify?
I mean, I think that's a big one. I think there are a few others. So, first off, I think we want to, take a moment to recognize why it is that the Trump White House and their allies really are seeking to sideline science, because that's what this is, right? They are doing this because scientists and evidence stand in the way of their greed, of their corporate polluters, of all those decisions they're taking to basically influence billionaires and their billionaire backers. And so sidelining scientists, I think, sadly, it is not new. Goes back hundreds, thousands of years, if you know some of your history. But what we are seeing under the current Trump presidency is, again, as we say, sadly, unprecedented. That the thousands of scientists who have been fired, who have been let go through the reductions in forces, who have been forced out, who have been silenced, who have been intimidated. Their goal is they're shrinking these agencies. Think about the Environmental Protection Agency, think about the research that happens at Health and Human Services. They're getting rid of those agencies and those scientists who do the work that produces the, number one, the evidence that shows the pollution, the evidence that shows the harms. And then they're getting rid of those folks who would be there to help produce solutions, to show, here is what safe air looks like. Here is what clean water should look like. So one big challenge certainly is sidelining those scientists. So there's the removal of those actual people. You mentioned certainly the loss of funding. So much of it sadly done under that name of efficiency, government efficiency, which is not true. There is amazing research done by universities and organizations for decades now that shows that science is an amazing economic investment. For every dollar you invest in science, it can produce up to $2.50 of return. right? So if you think about how much of our economy is driven by technology, indeed, by health and medicine, so much of that began with federal funding for scientific research within the federal government, but also, like you mentioned, and who's taken a big hit are the universities and colleges and research institutions that have used those federal dollars to do that research that goes on and becomes that economic generator. So that's also a big challenge that we will see, and sadly, some of those impacts will only be known for or be known in years and decades to come. The last thing, and it's the overarching umbrella under which these various threats sit, and that's this democratic backsliding. That is this increasing rise of authoritarian tactics that we're seeing. Again, the concentrating of power, the threatening of people, the sidelining of science, all of this. And we've produced a number of new pieces and research showing the dangers of the authoritarian tactics that we're seeing. And so I think that's sadly, the larger threat that has me the most concerned right now.
And I'm wondering, Dr. Jones, if Union of Concerned Scientists centers narrative and storytelling or even has that as an aspect of the work you do. I'm thinking of like climate scientists who for a long time struggled with sharing their science to the public, just sort of to lay audiences, and struggling with that because, of course, they want to be scientists first and foremost. And when you're telling stories, you have to round things down. You have to be a little more reductive. And yet the importance of science is so central to our lives, and I think people underestimate just how big a role science plays in our lives, from being able to pay attention to the meteorologist telling us about coming rainstorms, to warning us about pandemics, to trusting the latest flu vaccine. Is storytelling important to UCS?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Most of us, and if I think about humans as a species, it is that storytelling that really defines us. And it is so powerful, I think, for each of us as individuals and therefore, how we seek to make change. And that includes storytelling to bring new people to join us, to work with us, all the way up to storytelling to educate and inform members of Congress and decision makers. So I would say again that science alone will not drive change, right? It can help support the lived experience for those that are on the front lines of climate change. We also I want to mention partner with so many environmental justice communities, so many frontline communities, so many coalitions, and one way we can embrace storytelling is uplifting their voices as well. So we have guest blogs for folks to share their personal stories. We've done joint statements. We do case studies. We've had social media takeovers where folks have shared their stories. And, I'm also thinking about this past summer, we took about a dozen of members of our science network, and these are practicing science from around the country, and they came to Capitol Hill. And during the course of a week, they met with dozens of members of Congress's offices to tell their stories about how the Trump actions right now are hurting science, hurting them, hurting the future of science, their communities, their families. And it was really powerful. There is no substitution for putting a person in front of a decision maker. And so that really matters.
Who are your allies in the social justice universe? Union of Concerned Scientists, how do you see it as fitting in the landscape and working with, and not just for the Center for Science and Democracy, but the organization as a whole?
Yeah. Well, I think our natural allies are anyone that's pro-democracy and believes that truth and governance are hallmarks of a functional society. As fact finders, I think scientists have a unique and trusted role in our society. And as democratic norms erode, they can help preserve the truth by continuing to advance that evidence-based work. So, I mentioned the rise of authoritarian tactics that we're seeing. And so many of those allies range from certainly, nonprofits, the coalitions that we sit in, so many partners. And, lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't say, we're a member supported organization. We have 500,000 members and supporters that show up and help us do this work. They are there when we have calls to action to call their members of Congress to sign on to a letter to join an action that might be happening on the streets or in a capitol somewhere. And then, in addition to the 500,000 members and supporters, we also have what I mentioned, that science network, that group of scientists who we call on, especially for their unique expertise, whether it's helping us review current regulations, whether it's traveling to Capitol Hill and sharing their story, and so much more. But I think at the end of the day, I would just come back to our allies are those people that really believe in truth, that really believe in the importance of evidence, and the belief that, science and decision making in government at all levels should be free of political influence, that science itself should be done free of the political influence, and that it should work for especially justice and equity.
So, in terms of the membership, does one have to be a scientist to be a member of UCS?
No, anybody can become a member and support us. Certainly go to our website and ucs.org, and you'll find resources there. We have all the social media handles that we put out information where we share actually storytelling videos by partners, by folks, so much more. So anybody is absolutely welcome to join, and by joining, you'll get the email alerts and the updates and the opportunity of when to share. And we have webinars all the time that might be informing folks about how to take action for a piece of legislation, how to perhaps write your own story to share in your local paper, your local social media outlets. So, but then within that, our larger membership, we have that science network. That is indeed a group of about 22,000 scientists. And so if somebody, and that includes scientists from natural scientists, social scientists, economists, you name it. If you're somebody that has scientific expertise and you want to become a member of our science network, go to our website again, ucs.org, and there you'll find an application. And those members of the Science Network are indeed vetted to make sure they have some of the expertise that will help us advance these long-term goals.
I want to ask, if you don't mind, in the last part of our conversation, to have you talk a little bit about disinformation, since that's also something that you work on. Just given where we are today, how closely the spread of disinformation seems related to the rise of authoritarianism. And in the age of artificial intelligence, especially, it seems as though it has become easier than ever to flood the public discourse with completely wrong information that fuels, human rights violations, dehumanization, and sycophantic attachment to cults of personality. How central and important is that, and what are some of the ways in which you work on tackling that?
Yeah, the Trump White House and their cronies have really created a whole new level of disinformation. It has become their working style on a daily basis. If you think back to a few years ago, or even especially during the COVID pandemic, if you had any questions or concerns about how to keep your family safe, you probably, most of us believe that we could go to the federal government website like the CDC and get trusted and reliable information. We would have at that time known that information to be, created by scientists, free of that political influence, and that we would have believed it. And I would say that if you go to that website today, and actually today, because it was changed, I believe, yesterday, maybe the day before, what you are now seeing is complete disinformation campaigns around vaccines. Just again, it's not science, it's complete lies, it's complete political manipulation to advance their goals and their own anti-science narratives around vaccines. And it is going against not just the consent, I mean, it's going against the consensus of the entire medical community. Again, you can go to our website and we have a disinformation toolkit and a disinformation handbook with some strategies that folks can use for that. So I think first and foremost, that's a really important tactic. And then, I come back to also, sharing people's stories.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for joining us today. Give out a website for the Union of Concerned Scientists where people can find out more and also become a member if they want.
Absolutely. Folks can go to www.ucs.org.
I will post a link to that from our website. Thank you so much for joining us. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
My guest has been Dr. Jen Jones, Director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She leads the center's research, policy, and outreach efforts around science policy, scientific integrity, science of elections, and disinformation. This is Rising Up for Justice, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.